Right, on to the next video. Now, tell me, does anyone know what 1848 is in reference to? I mean, obviously you can probably read, but I do have to wonder, absent all of this, if you just saw the word or the number 1848, what significance would it hold for you? How much do you know about the year 1848? Well, I figured might as well cover it, especially since we couldn't really think of much to cover for another video. So let's talk about 1848, one of, if not the most significant year in world history. See, in the Americas, 1848 marks the end of the Mexican-American War and the modern U.S.-Mexico border. There was a bit of a change with the Gadsden Purchase later in the 1850s, but it was a minor one, and most of what we would call the modern-day U.S.-Mexico border would be defined in 1848 at the end of the Mexican-American War. What happened was California and parts of Texas, and all in between, were transferred to the United States in exchange for compensation that the U.S. would provide to Mexico. It was basically a purchase at gunpoint, or theft, or honestly, let's call it conquest, since that would be the most applicable term, because states don't really care so much about the idea of theft. Might makes right is basically their governing principle. Also, the Oregon Territory was organized, and basically, after the 1846 treaty, reorganized in 1848, which eventually led to the adding of the states of Oregon and later Washington. But 1848 was significant in U.S. history because it was largely the biggest land grab in U.S. history outside Louisiana Purchase, and, importantly, was also the end of James K. Polk's presidency. He had a bit more time left, but Polk basically did what he said he would do, became influential through said actions, and then didn't run again. With, of course, the rest of the Americas feeling the effects as the United States grew greatly in power during that period, and now had access to the Pacific coast. But with Europe, there was quite a bit more that happened. See, the Springtime of the Peoples, as it was known, was a series of revolts led against European monarchies, generally speaking, but some, protests and other similar civil unrest did occur in even the more Republican governments in Europe. Of note, in particular, was France, the German Confederation, which was a collection of German states, the Hungarian and Italian parts of Austria, specifically the Austrian Empire, which was technically a part of the German Confederation, but due to feudalism, Hungary and Italy were kind of separate. Denmark, with not only pushes for constitutional monarchy, but also the Schleswig War, which was trying to secede from Denmark as duchies and join Germany. And, of course, the Italian states had their own civil revolts, starting in Sicily, but later expanding to the rest of the peninsula. See, what happened there was essentially that after Napoleon, the Congress of Vienna decided the new borders for the European states. This would change with the Congress of London after Belgian revolts occurred and led to the state we now know as Belgium. But, importantly, this also led to a lot of power concentrated in a few reactionary princes, who basically wanted to undo all of Napoleon's reforms. Naturally, this led to a lot of issues, and so what ended up happening was a bunch of liberals would later revolt, essentially crying for nationalism to win. In the Italian states, the Pope was overthrown, Sardinia-Piedmont expanded into Austria, got kicked out at the end, but still tried. A republic was declared in Italy, in Venice specifically, trying to get free from Austria. A bunch of fights happened, and all of that continued for a while. And while most of these revolts were suppressed or otherwise defeated eventually, it did lead to reforms and a rise in nationalism across Europe, in particular Germany and Italy. See, Russia had tried to help, and did successfully help, crush some revolts in Austria, particularly the Hungarians. There were also interventions later on in Wallachia, if I'm not mistaken. but I could be misremembering that one. But the important thing is, although they were defeated, it basically severed the last ties to the old reactionary status quo, which was set up specifically to prevent another Napoleon. Von Metternich was forced to retire. France was returned to a republic, which wouldn't last long because they elected Napoleon III, as their new president. And several other incidents occurred, leading to a lot of calls for national unification. In particular, a constitution was established in Sardinia-Piedmont, which would pave the way for the Kingdom of Italy to establish itself. And in Germany, a man by the name of Otto von Bismarck was hired to help the current leader of Prussia handle the internal situation, which would lead to him eventually concluding that nationalism was inevitable, so it's better to push for German unification under Prussia rather than let the nationalists basically sweep over and take control, which led eventually to German unification in the 1860s and 70s. Now, Germany officially was united in 1871, but the groundwork was being laid all the way back in the 1850s, to wars in the 1860s, and then final war with France in 1870 to 71. 1848 was essentially the pivoting point for a lot of history, at least in Europe and the Western world, because it really shook the ground of the current status quo and changed things massively. It may be hard to understand, especially from the modern progressive lens of constant forward momentum, but after Napoleon, they really went back and tried to essentially maintain the old status quo. It was after 1848 that restraint was broken, and the monarchs and republics of the world were forced to accept, okay, maybe we gotta change things. In Europe in particular, this was a massive deal, but it did carry over to the rest of the world through Europe basically showing up and making their problems everyone else's problems. Mostly through boats. Gunboats. Quite effective they are. But needless to say, this year was massively important. It was the year that shifted Europe from a bunch of monarchies trying their best to hold on to a bunch of nation states in the making, trying to unite and form into proper, nations. Proper states built upon a national identity. It would pave the way for Italian unification, German unification, reforms in the United Kingdom and the Netherlands, along with Denmark and Sweden. They would make Russia get a bit nervous, but also adapt as necessary, and it would destabilize, partially, the Ottoman Empire. It wasn't as big of a deal to the Ottomans, because, honestly, the Ottomans were suffering regardless, no big change there. But there were definitely influences outside of just Europe, and outside of the United States. Obviously, the rest of the Americas definitely felt the U.S. gaining a lot of influence, especially with the later California gold rush. And, of course, for Africa and Asia, the consolidation of what would be the Western powers would definitely cause them some, I'd say pain, but honestly, constant suffering and realizing, frequently get conquered would be more accurate. Because let's face it, they couldn't exactly compete, and they couldn't exactly adapt. Not for lack of trying, mind you. Several countries did try to adapt, but with a modern, more reformed Europe, good luck with that, especially with corrupt bureaucrats slowing down every aspect of reform. Fact is, for as much as people see things and think, yes, these guys totally had the ability to compete with Europe, it would later be proven not to be the case, especially in 1836. See, 1836 really showed Europe's strength, especially when compared to a power like China, the Qing specifically. And with 1848, this was further reinforced as the states would now try to unite as nations. It was no longer just, we're fighting some king over a foreign land. It's now, we are fighting the British, we are fighting the French, the Italians, the Germans. And that would play a big role in how both these states would conduct the wars, viewing them not as just geopolitical strategies, but also as key for the prestige of the nation. And also, it would inevitably lead to much more centralized and populous states. Let's face it, if Sardinia Piedmont showed up and said, hey, China, open the freaking gates, we want to trade, the Qing would have laughed them out of the room. But if it's Italy showing up, well then, that changes things. And if it's Germany, oh, freak, better give them a treaty port just to be safe. And of course, the United States would also benefit from the 1840s being able to send squadrons from the Pacific coast on to Asia. If you don't know who Commodore Perry is, look into him and what his fleets did. It was especially important for Japanese history. But needless to say, the consolidation in what we would now call the West into these nation states can largely be traced to 1848, because while early Napoleonic times did lead to nationalism coming into being as an actual power, an influential ideology, we would only really see it become a major one in 1848, where nationalists would rise up across Europe and establish temporary, but still very real states throughout the area. With, of course, the caveats that several were crushed. Actually, most of them were. It's just, you were basically forced to acknowledge that it wasn't just the result of a Napoleon or the French Revolution. It was something that was permanent, here to stay, couldn't just be crushed, and they had to adapt to it. I'm mostly rambling at this point. Do apologize there. But I do hope you enjoyed the video. Have a good one, and goodbye.